Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of our YouTube mini-series about Khad Gadya, One Goat, Many Melodies. I hope you enjoyed the first episode we did yesterday, where we looked at the text and the history of Khad Gadya as we know it today, as well as the traditional melody that we normally do here in the States. Today, we're going to look at something a little different. Today, we're going to talk about and we're going to listen to Khad Gadya in the Italian tradition. And there are so many different facets of Khad Gadya in the Italian Jewish tradition. And before we get into that, I just want to give some information, some basic information about Italian Jewry and specifically the Jewish musical culture of Italy. So the earliest musical sources that we have of Italian Jewish music ever existing can date back all the way to the early 1600s by a Jewish Italian composer who is one of my favorites and it's one of my passions, is Salomone Rossi, who wrote Jewish music in the style of the Italian Renaissance, sounded very similar to Palestrina, sounded very similar to Monteverdi, and wrote polyphonic choral Jewish music for the synagogue during that time. His music was not able to be used in the synagogue at the time. The Jewish communities and most of the rabbis of that time period and that region made it forbidden for that music to be sung in the synagogue. But that paved the way for Jewish compositions to survive and to exist. And with that being said, there are other facets of Jewish music that also exist, both parallel and perhaps perpendicular to the art form of music. And one of those things is what's called nusach. Nusach, the word nusach in Hebrew, has two different meanings. One is the actual text of the service and the order of the text in which everything appears. So a Sephardic Siddur would be called nusach Sephard. But nusach, there's also musical nusach, which is the actual chant modes for the service. And when it comes to chanting the Bible, the Torah, Haftorah, books of the prophets, the Megillot, all that kind of stuff, that is not called nusach, that is called trope, cantillation. But the cantillation of the service is referred to as nusach. And of course, the Italian rite has its very own specific nusach. Now, that nusach is different depending on the region in Italy that we would be talking about. The nusach in Rome is one thing. And depending on if you're Ashkenazic or Sephardic in Rome, it's different. The nusach in Venice would be different as well, again, depending on if you're Ashkenaz or if you're Sephardic. And then, of course, there's even nusach italki, which is the Italian rite by itself, which is also separate from Ashkenazic and Sephardic, and is also has variance depending on the region in Italy that we are talking about. Musicologically, that all kind of dictates the different variations and the different types of melodies that we have for Khad Gadya in the Italian tradition. Luckily, there was a former music professor from UCLA who did research on this, did research on Khad Gadya itself and the many different traditions and musical traditions that exist for Khad Gadya. That professor, who's no longer with us, but his name is Abraham Schwadron. And I also want to thank my colleague and one of my mentors, Chazan Lance Tapper, for telling me about Professor Schwadron. Professor Schwadron was Cantor Tapper's professor when he was at UCLA as a student. And he told me about this research that Schwadron did with Khad Gadya. He wrote numerous papers, journal articles, thesis in the academic world on the subject, and even produced a professional or quote-unquote professional recording series of 25 different versions of Khad Gadya coming from different regions. German, Yiddish, Italian, Ladino, even some from the Netherlands, I believe. And that all can be found online. But in this project, in this research that Professor Schwadron did, he found over 200 different musical versions of Khad Gadya. And of course, out of that 200, he extracted 3 different Italian versions, 3 or 4, that he highlighted. And then he wrote different journal articles about the Italian traditions of Khad Gadya. So I would like to share with you some information about these different versions, and then I will also play some recordings of those versions. So the very first version, according to this article that Professor Schwadron wrote, this first version is in Italian. And in the Jewish communities, we should also note that when something is in Hebrew and Aramaic and or Italian, that it is not always exclusively one or the other of those languages. Sometimes it's a combination, which is actually referred to as Judeo-Italian. It is the same concept as Ladino, which is kind of a combination of Hebrew and Spanish, with some Portuguese thrown in. And it's the same concept as Yiddish, which is, of course, Hebrew and mostly German, but with some Polish and Russian thrown in as well. So with Judeo-Italian, it's the same thing. Some Hebrew and some Italian. And we will hear a little bit of this in the recordings. But this very first example is a version of Khad Gadya that's primarily in Italian, that comes from the region of Firenze. And the recording that I'm going to play for you of this is actually recorded both in the original Aramaic that Khad Gadya is written in. That's how we find it in the Haggadah today, as well as in the Italian and the possible Judeo-Italian. So let me get to the recording. And the person singing this is by the name of Fernando Belgrado, who was a Rabbi Chazan in Italy. And this was recorded in 1982.
Khad Gadya, Khad Gadya, desabina babi trezunze, Khad Gadya, Khad Gadya, ve'ata shunara, ve'achal legadya, desabina babi trezunze, Khad Gadya, Khad Gadya. Un capretto che comprò il signor padre per 2 scudi, un capretto, e venne il gatto che mangiò il capretto che comprò il signor padre per 2 scudi, un capretto, e venne il cane che morsicò il gatto che mangiò il capretto che comprò il signor padre per 2 scudi, un capretto. E venne a Kadosh Baruch Hu che sciachtò il Malach Hamavet, che sciachtò il Shochet, che sciachtò il Bove, che beve l'acqua, che spense il fuoco, che bruciò il bastone, che picchiò il cane, che morsicò il gatto, che mangiò il capretto, che comprò il signor padre per 2 scudi un capretto.
So as you can hear, the recording started with the traditional Aramaic of Khad Gadya, more or less as we know the text today. Then it went into Italian, and then after a couple of seconds of Italian, it went into this Judeo-Italian combination of the Hebrew and the Italian. And again, according to Professor Schwadron, this melody, or this set of melodies, as you could probably hear, there was about 2 or 3 different transitions and changes in the melody, originate from Firenze in Italy. Now, the next recording that I'm going to play is the Venetian version of Khad Gadya, which is also sung in Italian. And so this originates from Venice. And specifically, according to Professor Schwadron, this originates from a specific family, I believe. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That is a different one we're going to look at. My apologies. This is the Venetian version of Khad Gadya in Italian, and it is sung by Colombo Vitaliano, who is a member of the Jewish Venetian community, who is one of the last people alive, or at least at the time of the recording, was one of the last people alive to continue this tradition of the Venetian Khad Gadya.
Capretta, capretta, che ga compraso pare per un susetto. Capretta, capretta, e se viene il gatto che ga mangia il capretto, che ga compraso pare per un susetto. Capretta, capretta, e se vegno el can, che ga morsiga el gato, che ga mangia il capretto, che ga compraso pare per un susetto. Capretto, capretto, e se vegno a Kadosh Baruch, che ga copa el malachamavet, che ga copa el shofet, che ga shachta el bo, che ga bebu el agua, que gabruza que gastúa el fuego, que gabruza el bastón, que bastón al can, que morcega el gato, que maña el caprito, que compraso pare, per un susetto, capreto, capreto.
So that is the version from Venice. And as you could hear, it mostly was in Italian, until the very last verse, where when talking about Hakadosh Baruch Hu, when talking about God, slaughtering the angel of death, that it went into the Judeo-Italian combination language again. And you could hear there was a little bit of Hebrew words and Aramaic words, and then of course the Italian words. And one thing to note about Hebrew in Italy is that the pronunciation of the Hebrew is very, very different than what we know today. Obviously, we know, depending on which generation that we're part of, we know the Ashkenazic pronunciation of Hebrew, which originates mostly from Germany and Poland and Russia. But then, of course, the more modern pronunciation of Hebrew, which is what a lot of the Sephardic communities pronounce Hebrew with. But then there are these little intricacies of the pronunciation in the Italian, as well as other cultures as well. But in the Italian pronunciation of Hebrew, that's very guttural. And very, certain letters that in modern Hebrew are silent, don't have a sound to them. These letters have like a very guttural type of sound. So it's very interesting to hear that and to listen to that. Now, the last musical example that I'm going to play, the recording I'm going to play, is I'm based on the writings of Professor Schwadron. I am piecing together, I believe, comes from a rabbi. According to Professor Schwadron, he says that this example was sung for me by Rabbino Capo Elia Ricchetti of Trieste in recollection of his grandmother's tune. She was born in Florence, but in the section called Pitigliano. However, at his own Seder, Rabbi Ricchetti sings another musical version in Aramaic from Gorizia, which came from his father. So the one that is his grandmother's tune is actually similar to the first recording that I played, the one from Firenze. But this one I'm going to play comes from Rabbi Ricchetti as well, but from his father, and specifically from Gorizia, according to the research that Professor Schwadron did. So this is the final recording of that.
Khad Gadya, Desa bina babi trezuse. Khad Gadya, Ve'ata shunra ve'achal legadia. Desa bina babi trezuse. Khad Gadya. Ve'ata kadosh baruch hu, ve'shachat lemalach hamavet, de'shachat le'shochet, de'shachat le'torah, de'shata le'maya, de'chava le'norah, de'saraf le'hutra, de'ika le'chalba, de'nashach le'shunra, de'achal le'gadia, Desabina babi trezuse. Khad Gadya.
So that is the third recording that is part of this compilation and part of this anthology of Italian Khad Gadya recordings, again put together by Professor Schwadron. I want to point out and I want to mention that as much as I do my own research on Jewish music from the Renaissance period, specifically and more particularly from Italy, I do not consider myself an expert in these more cultural traditions and almost folk traditions in a way of Jewish music, particularly when it's melodies that survive through the game of telephone, where it's just sung from one generation to another and it's transmitted over time through the generations, as opposed to the music being written down. And therefore, I would actually like to mention that here in Phoenix, and particularly at Bethel, we do have somebody who is an expert in Jewish Italian culture and an Italian Jewry, and that would actually be our rabbi's husband, Daniel Steinkoken. And Daniel, if you are watching, I would love to analyze the information that I included today and find out your thoughts, and and if you have any additional information that you could possibly share with us, I would love to hear more about it. I hope that everybody enjoyed this episode with the Italian versions of Khad Gadya, or in Italian as they call it, una capretto, one goat. And I hope everybody stays safe and stays healthy. The next episode will be live streamed on Sunday. It's right now scheduled for 12 noon. And we will be looking at a more fun and a little bit of a wild version of Khad Gadya then. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please make sure, if you're able to like the video, share the video, say hello in the comment section below the video, and please share this with your family and friends. I wish everybody to stay safe and healthy, and have a happy Passover next week, and Shabbat Shalom. Have a good one. See you later.